The slap wasn't loud, but the silence that followed made it deafening. The moment Amanda Rivers' palm connected with the elderly woman's arm, the entire first-class cabin froze. A sharp inhale, a clatter of a dropped glass, the rustling of fabric as passengers shifted, torn between pretending they hadn't seen anything and acknowledging the undeniable fact that they had. For a split second, Amanda herself seemed stunned. She hadn't planned to get physical. She wasn't that kind of person. But the way the woman just sat there, calm and unbothered, had gotten under her skin. And now, as she stood over her, breath tight in her chest, she realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The woman, Evelyn Hart, didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't cry out. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if she had seen this before, as if she had expected it. She adjusted the silk scarf around her shoulders, her movement slow and deliberate, then reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. One tap, then another, a single message sent. And just like that, Amanda's fate was sealed. The day had started like any other. The airport was a blur of motion. Suitcases rolling, flight announcements crackling overhead, people hurrying through security with coffee cups and exhausted expressions. Amanda thrived in this chaos. She was a senior flight attendant, one of the best. She knew how to command a cabin, how to enforce the rules, how to put passengers in their place when necessary. So when she saw Evelyn Hart standing at the entrance of first class, ticket in hand, something didn't sit right. The woman was alone, elderly but composed, dressed in a modest navy blue dress with polished flats. She had the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, and that irritated Amanda. Amanda had seen people try to sneak into first class before. She prided herself on sniffing them out. She took one look at Evelyn and made a decision. "Ma'am," she said, stepping in front of the woman's seat before she could sit down. "This section is for first-class passengers only." Evelyn blinked up at her, then smiled slightly. "I know." Amanda folded her arms. "Then I'll need to see your boarding pass." Evelyn handed it over without a word. Amanda skimmed it quickly. Seat 2A, first class, no mistakes. But something in her gut still nagged at her. She handed the ticket back, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Just making sure." Evelyn nodded, took her seat, and reached into her bag, pulling out a worn paperback. Amanda lingered a moment longer, waiting for something. An apology, maybe. A little embarrassment. But Evelyn didn't give her the satisfaction. She simply turned the page, her expression unreadable. Amanda's irritation simmered. The rest of the passengers filed in, first class filling up with businessmen and well-dressed professionals. Amanda made her rounds, serving pre-flight drinks and ensuring the cabin was perfect. But every time she glanced at Evelyn, the woman was exactly the same, quiet, still, unaffected. And then just before takeoff, Amanda saw her chance. A last-minute passenger arrived, an executive type, sharp suit, Bluetooth earpiece still in. Amanda knew the type, someone important, someone the airline liked to keep happy. And, as luck would have it, there were no more first-class seats. Amanda walked briskly back to Evelyn's seat, stopping just beside her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move." Evelyn looked up. "Move?" "Yes, there was an error in the seating assignment." Amanda kept her tone professional but firm. "We'll need this seat for another passenger." Evelyn closed her book and set it on her lap. "My ticket says 2A. "I understand, but Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Then the error is on your side." A flicker of heat rushed up Amanda's neck. She was not used to being questioned, especially not by someone who barely raised her voice. "Ma'am, I'm trying to be accommodating here. There's a seat in premium economy." "No." The firmness of the response threw Amanda off. Evelyn wasn't being aggressive, wasn't making a scene, but the sheer certainty in her tone made Amanda's teeth clench. The businessman was watching now, as were a few other passengers. Amanda leaned in slightly. "Look, I'm asking you to cooperate." Evelyn met her gaze. "And I'm declining." Amanda's patience snapped. Without thinking, she reached down and grabbed the woman's arm just above the wrist. Not hard, just enough to make her move. That was the moment everything fell apart. The gasp from a nearby passenger. The sharp intake of breath from one of the younger flight attendants. The way Evelyn slowly turned her head to look at Amanda's hand, as if examining a piece of dust on her sleeve. And then she pulled her phone out. One message. Sent. Amanda took a shaky step back, releasing her grip. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating, irreversible. A single ping echoed from the cockpit, then another. A few rows back, a businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at his own phone as if expecting something. Evelyn tucked her phone away and folded her hands in her lap, looking more composed than ever. Amanda's pulse pounded. Something was wrong. And then, over the intercom, a voice crackled through, slow and deliberate. "This is Daniel Hart." Amanda's blood ran cold. "Would you like to repeat what you just said about my wife?" Amanda felt the blood drain from her face. The intercom had gone silent, but the weight of that voice still hung heavy in the cabin. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Some shifted uncomfortably, others openly turned in their seats. The businessmen who had been waiting for Evelyn's seat suddenly looked anywhere but at Amanda. She forced herself to swallow. She barely recognized her own voice. "I was just trying to correct a seating issue." A pause, then through the speaker that same measured, razor-sharp voice. "And how exactly did you attempt to correct it?" Amanda's throat went dry. This was bad, very bad. She glanced toward the front of the plane, hoping the captain would intervene, but the cockpit door remained shut. No help was coming. The younger flight attendant, Claire, had backed up toward the galley, her face pale. She looked like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. Smart girl. Amanda turned back to Evelyn, who still hadn't moved. The older woman met her gaze with quiet patience, as if waiting to see how much deeper she would dig her own grave. Amanda took a breath, steeling herself. She could fix this. "Sir," she said, trying to keep her tone professional, "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. I was just following standard procedure. Your wife's seat was needed for—" Daniel cut her off. "Is my wife's ticket valid?" Amanda clenched her teeth. "Yes, but then there was no mistake." The finality in his tone sent a chill through her. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Amanda felt her pulse in her ears, loud and frantic. She needed to get ahead of this. She turned toward Evelyn, lowering her voice. "Ma'am, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. If there was any confusion, I sincerely apologize." Evelyn simply tilted her head, considering her. "Is that so?" Amanda nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Of course, I never meant to make you uncomfortable." Evelyn held her gaze for a moment longer, then reached for her phone. One swipe, one tap. Amanda's stomach twisted as she realized what was happening. Before she could speak, the cockpit door swung open. Captain Reed stepped out, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He was a seasoned pilot, a man who rarely intervened in cabin matters unless it was absolutely necessary. And yet here he was. Amanda straightened, trying to appear composed. "Captain, His gaze cut through her like a knife. "Miss Rivers, come with me, now." The murmurs started immediately. First-class passengers exchanged glances. A man in a suit muttered something under his breath. Amanda's legs felt like lead as she followed the captain toward the front of the plane. As she passed Evelyn's seat, the older woman didn't so much as look up. Inside the cockpit, the air was suffocating. The door shut behind her with a soft click, but it may as well have been the sound of a cell door slamming shut. Captain Reed stood in front of her, arms crossed. Beside him, a small screen flickered to life. On the other end was a man in a dark suit, his face impassive. Amanda recognized him immediately. Ryan Porter, the airline's senior operations director. Her stomach dropped. Porter wasted no time. "Miss Rivers, as of this moment, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight." Amanda's breath hitched. "Sir, Be quiet." The captain's voice was cold, final. Amanda clamped her mouth shut. Porter continued. "You will take a crew jump seat in the rear of the aircraft and will not interact with passengers for the rest of the flight. Upon landing, you are to report directly to airline administration for review." Amanda's hands balled into fists. "You're suspending me? Over this?" The captain didn't blink. "You put your hands on a passenger." "I didn't—" "Stop." Porter's voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. "This isn't a discussion." Amanda's pulse pounded. She had never been removed from duty mid-flight. She turned to Captain Reed, grasping for some kind of lifeline. "Captain, you know me. You know I wouldn't—" His jaw tightened. "Get your things." Amanda stood frozen. Porter's voice came through once more, quiet and final. "Do not make this worse than it already is." The screen went black. Amanda exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling. Without another word, she turned and stepped out of the cockpit. The first-class cabin was silent. Every eye was on her. The businessman who had expected her to move Evelyn had suddenly found a deep interest in his newspaper. Claire looked away, her face unreadable. Amanda forced herself forward, each step toward the back of the plane heavier than the last. The walk of shame had begun. Amanda moved through the aisle, each step dragging her deeper into humiliation. The flight was silent, but the weight of 100 stairs pressed against her back. Some passengers watched openly, others with barely concealed smirks. The businessman who had expected her to move Evelyn now avoided eye contact entirely. Coward. She reached the back of the plane, where the crew jump seats were positioned near the galley. The space felt smaller than usual, suffocating. Claire stood nearby, her hands fidgeting as she pretended to rearrange a stack of plastic cups. She didn't look up. Amanda slid into the narrow seat and buckled in, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. The intercom dinged. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all carry-on items are secured." Amanda barely heard the words. Her mind was a storm of panic. A mistake. That's all this was. One misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. She took a shaky breath. Maybe she still had a chance. Maybe she could fix this when they landed. Claire finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Are you okay?" Amanda's jaw clenched. "I don't need your pity," Claire sighed. "It's not pity." Amanda didn't respond. She stared at the galley wall, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her uniform. She had spent years commanding respect, ensuring that passengers followed the rules. And now, here she was, stripped of her authority, sitting in the very section she had spent her career avoiding. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just about her job. It was about power, control, and she had just lost all of it. The descent continued. Outside the small window near the galley, the city lights flickered into view, a sprawling web of gold against the dark. The airport loomed ahead, a glowing beacon of arrivals and departures. Amanda's heart pounded. As soon as they landed, she would have to face the consequences. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she was ready. The wheels touched down with a smooth but final thud. The usual scattered applause rippled through the cabin, but Amanda barely heard it. Her fingers dug into the edges of her seatbelt, her pulse hammering. The runway lights streaked past the window as the plane slowed, taxiing toward the gate. Every second felt like another nail sealing her fate. She forced herself to take a breath. Maybe this was salvageable. Maybe if she just explained, if she could talk to the right person, this whole situation could be reframed. The overhead chime signaled the seatbelt sign turning off. Passengers immediately stirred, unbuckling, stretching, reaching for their bags. For them, this was just another flight, another landing. For Amanda, this was the end of everything she had built. Then she saw them. Just beyond the open airplane door, standing in the jet bridge, was a group of airline executives. Their polished shoes and stiff postures were unmistakable. And in the center of them stood a man she recognized immediately, Daniel Hart. Her stomach lurched. He was calm, too calm. His dark suit was crisp, his tie perfectly in place. He didn't need to raise his voice or glare to command the space. His presence alone was enough. But it wasn't just him. Two uniformed security officers flanked the group. Passengers whispered, some pretending not to notice, others openly staring. They knew exactly what was happening. They were about to witness a reckoning. Amanda's throat tightened. She had imagined disciplinary meetings before, worst-case scenarios where she'd have to explain herself to HR, maybe face a temporary suspension. But this wasn't a meeting. This was a public execution. Claire hesitated beside her, avoiding her gaze. Amanda swallowed the lump in her throat and slowly stood. She felt the shift immediately, passengers turning, their gazes heavy. No one moved to block her path. No one offered a word of support. She had spent years ruling the cabin, making decisions, ensuring that rules were followed. And now, she was the one being escorted out like a problem that needed to be handled. She stepped into the aisle. Daniel Hart's voice, calm but unwavering, cut through the murmurs. "Miss Rivers." She froze. His eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. The tension stretched, unbearable. And then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he gave the order. "Please show Miss Rivers the way out." Amanda's feet felt like lead as she stepped forward, the security officers falling into place beside her. They weren't touching her, but their presence alone made it clear. She wasn't leaving this plane on her own terms. The first-class passengers, the same ones who had watched her command the cabin with authority just hours ago, now stared at her with something between fascination and satisfaction. She could hear the hushed murmurs, the barely concealed whispers. "She's done. This is brutal. I almost feel bad, almost." Almost. Amanda gritted her teeth, forcing her chin up as she walked toward the exit. She wouldn't let them see her break. Not here, not yet. Evelyn Hart hadn't moved. She sat with quiet dignity, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching Amanda with the same patient expression she had worn the entire flight. No gloating, no smugness, just a calm certainty, as if she had known this was coming from the moment Amanda had grabbed her wrist. Amanda tried not to look at her, but just as she passed, Evelyn spoke. "I hope you remember this." The words were soft, but they cut deeper than anything Amanda had ever heard. Her stomach twisted, but she kept walking. The moment she stepped into the jet bridge, the air felt colder. The low hum of the airport beyond was a distant buzz against the roaring in her ears. The executives were waiting, their expressions unreadable. Daniel Hart stood at the center, his presence a quiet force of gravity. Amanda swallowed hard. "Mr. Hart, if I could just—" He lifted a hand. She shut her mouth. For a long moment, he simply studied her. No anger, no visible frustration, just a calculating gaze that made her skin crawl. "You will report to administration immediately," he said, his voice controlled. "Your employment status is under review." Amanda's nails dug into her palm. "Sir, if I could explain—" "There's nothing to explain," he said smoothly. "You made your decision the moment you disrespected my wife." The security officer beside her shifted slightly, a silent reminder that this conversation was not one she was in control of. Daniel glanced at one of the executives. "Take her." The finality in his tone sent a fresh wave of panic through Amanda. As they led her down the jet bridge, her legs felt weak. She wasn't walking into a meeting. She was walking into the end of her career. The hallway leading to the administrative offices was long, sterile, and far too quiet. The steady click of Amanda's heels against the polished floor felt deafening. She had walked through this terminal 100 times before, confident, in control, her uniform a symbol of authority. Now, stripped of that power, she felt like a stranger in a place she once ruled. The two security officers flanked her without a word. They weren't aggressive, but their presence made it clear she wasn't walking away from this. At the end of the hall, a glass-paneled door slid open. Inside, a conference room waited, cold and impersonal. A long table, a few chairs, and standing near the window, Rebecca Lynch, the airline's senior flight operations manager. Amanda had dealt with Rebecca before, a woman who rarely smiled, always professional, never one for unnecessary pleasantries. Today was no different. "Miss Rivers," Rebecca said without looking up from her tablet. "Sit." Amanda hesitated, but only for a second. She lowered herself into the chair across from Rebecca, forcing her posture straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Rebecca tapped her screen, scrolling through what Amanda could only assume was her employment file. Then, finally, she met her gaze. "This isn't a disciplinary hearing," she said flatly. "There will be no review process." Amanda's breath caught. "What?" Rebecca turned the tablet toward her. On the screen, bold and final, were the words "termination of employment, effective immediately." Amanda's stomach dropped. Her mouth opened, searching for the right words, the right defense, something, anything to stop this from happening. "There has to be a process," she said, her voice strained. "I've worked for this airline for years. Rebecca didn't blink. "And in those years, did you ever lay hands on a passenger?" Amanda stiffened. "It wasn't—" Rebecca tilted her head. "Yes or no?" Silence. Rebecca took that as her answer. "You are no longer employed by this airline," she said smoothly. "Your employment with us has officially ended. Your credentials are no longer active, and you are not scheduled for future assignments at this airport." Amanda's fingers dug into her lap. "This is absurd." Rebecca didn't react. She simply swiped her screen again, bringing up another document. "This," she said, "is a flagged employment notice." Amanda's heart pounded. She knew what that meant. "This record will be sent to every major airline affiliated with our network," Rebecca continued. "That includes over 40 domestic and international carriers. Effective immediately, you are ineligible for employment in any aviation-related role under our corporate agreements." Amanda's breath hitched. "You're blacklisting me?" Rebecca gave the smallest nod. "Mr. Hart requested it personally." The words hit like a slap. Amanda had known this was bad, but she hadn't understood just how far they would go. She could handle a suspension, even a firing, but this was a death sentence for her career. She gripped the edge of the table, her nails pressing into the surface. "I'll fight this," she said, though her voice wavered. "I'll take legal action." Rebecca didn't flinch. "You signed an employee conduct agreement upon hiring. Your violation is documented, recorded, and witnessed." She folded her hands neatly. You can fight it, Miss Rivers, but you won't win. Amanda's vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. Rebecca slid the tablet aside and reached for a small plastic tray. Your badge. Amanda's fingers twitched, but she didn't move. Rebecca exhaled through her nose. Your uniform will also be surrendered before you leave this building. Amanda's entire body went cold. She had worn that uniform for years. It wasn't just clothing. It was status, identity. And now they were taking that from her too. Rebecca checked her watch. A changing room is down the hall. A security officer will escort you. Amanda forced herself to stand, her legs shaky. She wanted to argue, to scream, to make them understand that this was unfair, too extreme, too final. But she knew it wouldn't matter. She was already erased. Amanda stepped into the small, windowless changing room, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly above her. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving her alone with the final remnants of her career. Her hands shook as she reached for the buttons of her uniform jacket. She had put this on thousands of times before. Each morning, each flight, each shift where she had walked through terminals with confidence, knowing she belonged. Now, stripping out of it felt like peeling away her entire identity. She unpinned her name badge, the metallic letters catching the light one last time before she placed it on the small tray by the sink. Next, her jacket, her neatly pressed blouse, the navy blue slacks that had once made her feel important. When she was done, she stood in her plain undershirt and leggings, shivering despite the temperature. The mirror in front of her reflected someone she didn't recognize. For years, she had built herself into the kind of woman who commanded authority, the kind who walked into a room and expected compliance, the kind who knew how to handle passengers, enforce policies, and remind people of their place. And yet here she was, stripped of all of it, reduced to nothing more than another former employee being ushered out the door. A sharp knock at the door. Amanda swallowed hard. 1 second. She reached for the plastic bag they had left for her, stuffing her uniform inside. The fabric felt heavier now, like dead weight in her hands. When she stepped back into the hallway, the security officer was waiting, his expression unreadable. Follow me, he said. She didn't argue. The walk back to the administrative office felt different this time, slower, heavier. She passed other employees, some she knew, some she didn't, but every single one of them knew what was happening. The whispers followed her, quiet but sharp, cutting through her already raw nerves. She's the one who got fired. I heard she put her hands on a passenger. She was senior crew, wasn't she? Amanda kept her chin up, but each word chipped away at the last sliver of pride she had left. At the front desk, Rebecca was waiting. Without looking up, she took the uniform bag, placed it aside, and slid a final document across the counter. Amanda hesitated. This is your acknowledgement of termination, Rebecca said smoothly. You sign it, and you're free to go. Free. The word felt hollow. Amanda picked up the pen, her grip tight. She skimmed the document, legal jargon, official statements, a final confirmation that she no longer belonged here. Her fingers twitched as she hovered over the signature line. A part of her still wanted to fight, to demand a second chance, to make them understand that this wasn't fair. But she knew. She knew that Daniel Hart had made sure there would be no second chances. With a slow exhale, she signed her name. Rebecca took the document, glanced at it, and gave a curt nod. You're done here. Amanda's stomach twisted. It was over. No farewell. No thank you for your service. Just 2 words that erased everything she had worked for. She turned on her heel, walking toward the exit. The glass doors slid open, and the rush of outside air hit her like a slap. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. Amanda stood at the curb outside the airport, gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her fingers ached. The air smelled of jet fuel and asphalt, the distant hum of car engines filling the space around her. People rushed past, passengers dragging suitcases, drivers honking, airport workers moving with purpose. Life moved on, but for her, everything had stopped. She had spent years walking through this terminal with purpose, her uniform crisp, her head high, knowing she was someone important. Now, she was just another person standing outside, unsure of where to go. A taxi pulled up in front of her. The driver rolled down the window, his voice casual. Need a ride, ma'am? Amanda opened her mouth, then hesitated. She had nowhere to tell him to go. No home waiting in another city. No flight assignment to prepare for. No future in the industry she had dedicated her entire life to. She shook her head. No, I'm good. The driver shrugged and pulled away, his taillights disappearing into the endless flow of traffic. Amanda pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over her contacts. She had spent years building connections, gaining influence, making sure people knew her name. Now, as she scrolled, she realized something horrifying. There was no one to call. One by one she tried. A former supervisor, a colleague, someone she had once considered a friend. Straight to voicemail, every time. The industry had already shut her out. Panic bubbled in her chest, sharp and unrelenting. She had lost her job, her status, her career. Without it, what was she? She clenched her jaw. No, she wasn't going to break down here in the middle of the airport like some washed-up nobody. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to think, to plan. She still had options, didn't she? Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A woman was struggling with a heavy suitcase near the rideshare pickup zone. It had tipped over, spilling the contents onto the pavement. People passed by without stopping. Amanda exhaled sharply. Someone should help her. She hesitated. Then before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped forward. She crouched, picking up a small bag that had rolled away. "Here," she said, handing it over. The woman looked up, surprised. "Oh, thank you. I didn't think anyone—" She trailed off, really looking at Amanda for the first time. Amanda suddenly realized why. The woman had seen her, on the plane. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. Amanda waited for judgment, for a smug comment, for another reminder of how far she had fallen. But instead, the woman just smiled. "That was kind of you." Amanda froze. Kind. No one had called her that in a long time. The woman zipped up her suitcase, gave Amanda a small nod of gratitude, then hurried toward her waiting car. Amanda stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. For years, she had believed power came from control, from enforcing rules, from making sure people knew their place. But in that moment, kneeling on the pavement, helping a stranger with no expectation of anything in return, she felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose. A new thought hit her, sudden and unexpected. She wasn't untouchable anymore. But maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Amanda let out a slow breath, lifted her chin, and took her first step forward. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid.
This content is a work of fiction and art designed for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities to real individuals or events are purely coincidental. Certain scenes and dialogues in the video are dramatized and contain elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator firmly opposes discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel adheres to YouTube's guidelines and respects copyright laws.